All right, everybody, welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm Joseph Sutkowi. I'm the Chief Waterfront Design Officer at Waterfront Alliance. Um, Part of my role is to oversee the WEDG program, the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines. That's what we're going to focus today's conversation about on this Climate Week webinar. So this will be the kind of the intersection of community work and WEDG, the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines. For those that aren't familiar, we will do kind of an overview 101 of the full standard as part of this conversation. That'll kind of be the how we spend the bulk of the time. So you get to know what wedge is, what matters in it, and then how it gets applied to from a community perspective, and kind of where the general public and community leaders and advocates really plug into the system. To just start off with a who is Waterfront Alliance? Um, Together, we lead the way for thriving and resilient waterfront shorelines and coastlines. We are a regional nonprofit based here in New York City. We're across New York, New Jersey Harbor, working on both sides of the Hudson, and do everything from climate resilience policy work at the local, state, and federal level, education work where our team is in middle schools and high schools doing water quality testing, taking kids on field trips to their local waterfronts. We're advocates for public access to the water and working on design projects and community projects that would open up waterfronts across the the city, including in the South Bronx, on Staten Island. We were the leading advocate behind the creation of the New York City Ferry program. We host the Waterfront Conference every year, which brings in this combination of real estate developers, kayaking clubs, shippers, the engineering community, environmental professionals, environmental activists, and volunteers. It's kind of everyone who has an interest in New York and New Jersey Harbor all in the room in one place. And then we have the WEDG program, the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines that we'll talk about today. WEDG started as a local tool. The first version of WEDG in 2015 was just for New York, New Jersey Harbor, meant as this local tool. But then we started to get calls from other cities across the country, Miami, Wilmington, North Carolina, saying, "Hey, this seems really useful. Can we have this here? Can we apply this here?" So 2015, we launched the first version. In 2019, we created a second version of Wedge that was applicable in all coastal communities across the country. And now, as of end of 2023, we have a version that's applicable to all waterways in the US. So while most of Waterfront Alliance's work is this regional and local work, Wedge is actually intended to be and functioning as a national program. And we'll talk about where some of those projects are in just a couple of minutes. But I want to kind of ground us first in what Wedge is and why it was created. So, regardless of where you are in the country, whether you're in Brooklyn and on the waterfront at Brooklyn Bridge Park, whether you are from Denver, where there's a recently designed wedge project on the South Platte River right downtown, or you're working in the Flat River in Greenville, Michigan, the random tiny town that I'm from. And all of those communities and everything in between, the waterfront is a really special place. It is where communities want to be. It's where our showcase parks are. It's where we have access to really cool recreational opportunities and nature opportunities. It's where the most valuable property is, and it's where the most at-risk property is. If we think about flooding and climate change, it's our first line of defense for our communities. So if we are doing any kind of development or restoration or ecological work on the waterfront, we're probably only doing that every 50, 70, 100 years if we look at historically how often we kind of touch or revamp the waterfront. And the central premise of Wedge is that we have to get it right. And we look at that as this balance between resilience, ecology, and access. And all three of those things should be present on all waterfronts across the country. We should be resilient to storms. We should have a waterfront that protects the community. We should embrace and enhance the ecology of our waterfronts so that we are protecting the really sensitive habitats and really unique habitats that exist there. And we should promote access so that the waterfront remains a place that's welcoming to everyone, that there's activity there, that there's 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 interest there, there's ways to get there. Um, and all of these things are what WEDG, the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, are really intended to help communities do with their waterfronts. So we are a rating system. For those kind of familiar with the space, you might know the LEED standards for buildings. It's kind of the most common, the most household name of rating systems. Think of us as the LEED standards, but focused specifically on the waterfront. And in that role, we are essentially providing a certification for individual sites across the country that they have built their waterfront, designed their waterfront to a really high standard and baked in resilience, ecology, and access. And that's, the really at the heart of what WEDG is all about, is finding ways to reward the sites that are doing this well and bring attention to those. And as Waterfront Alliance was thinking about kind of how do we how do we encourage better waterfront development across the country, and more ecological development, more environmentally sound development. Our response was to create WEDG. And the initial kind of conversations around WEDG, which really started after Hurricane Sandy, and the destruction here in New York and kind of across the eastern seaboard. We looked at the requests that Waterfront Alliance was getting. So we were, is kind of this regional planning organization. We got requests from developers all the time. Hey, will you support our project? Will you provide testimony in the land use review process in favor of us? And we get questions from community boards and other environmental groups saying, hey, there's this thing going up in my neighborhood. Is it good or is it bad? Was Waterfront Alliance thing? And our response to that was that we really need to have a set of criteria for when do we say yes and when do we support a project and when do we say this should absolutely not be built on our waterfront. This is not good enough. This area should be protected. We shouldn't put this development here. We needed a set of criteria, and then if we have this set of criteria, so we really ought to write this down to formalize it. If we've got this written down, we really ought to publish it in some fashion so that it's clear and public. And kind of, I like to think of this as like if you give a mouse a cookie fashion, it kind of continued to grow and spiral into now it's a rating system modeled very much after the LEED standards for buildings. The reason that we ended up with the rating system approach is, instead of just kind of a broader set of frameworks or principles, we created this scoring system behind what makes a good waterfront. And we did that because that can help establish really consistent standards for what makes a waterfront sound. It's a way to provide a certification and then really celebrate great projects. There are projects that clearly meet the standard, and we can document that, and then we can start to draw attention to those projects and say, hey, look at how great of a project this is. This is what all waterfront should be modeled after. This is the kind of developer or city project that actually got stakeholder engagement right, that actually got the environmental side right, that's actually doing a good job of protecting the community. That helps then other projects set targets and produce results around that. It's something to aim at. And then through that, both rewarding those projects that do get it right, helping others set targets, and then pressuring the ones that aren't there, that really pushes change across the field. And that's why we've kind of ended up with this rating system. It's our way of making change across the field, whether we are directly involved in the project or not. So there are 15 WEDG verified projects across the country. The Denver one that I mentioned earlier along the South Platte River is not actually pictured here for those who are counting. What I want to draw attention to in this slide is the diversity of project types that have earned WEDG verification. So these we consider some of the best waterfronts out there. They've gone through our standard. We really rigorously assessed them against 143 different metrics, and came to the conclusion that, you know what, these ones did a really good job. This is a good model for development. So we have the Illinois Beach State Park Shoreline Stabilization Project that's out in Illinois. I mentioned Wilmington and Miami before. Those are two public parks. Here in New York, we have South Battery Park City Resilience, which is recently reopened. Bronx Point is an affordable housing development in the Bronx. We have industrial facilities with Oak Point McKinnis Cement, Sunset Park Materials with recovery facility in Brooklyn. Some may know this better as Sims Recycling. We also have Hunters Point South and Brooklyn Bridge Park, Starlight Park in the Bronx. So some of these are, you know, the really flagship, very expensive public spaces, the kind of the flagship places like Brooklyn Bridge Park. Jose Marti in Miami and Starlight Park in the Bronx are very neighborhood serving. You know, they didn't have the incredible capital budgets. They're designed to serve just the neighborhood around them and do an incredible job at that. There are another 15 or so projects in the pipeline that are going through their really rigorous review now, will be added to this list if and when they pass over the next couple of years. And, you know, in addition to, you know, here we've got Illinois, New York, North Carolina, Colorado, Florida. There's projects in the pipeline in New Jersey and Connecticut, in Ohio, more in Florida, and California as well. So thinking through kind of what WEDG, and I'm going to keep saying WEDG, Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, as more participants join. If you get anything out of this webinar, I want it to be that WEDG is Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines. There's a few things that WEDG can kind of help do if you're sitting in, you know, sitting on a community board, sitting in another environmental organization, volunteering, or just see a project happening in your neighborhood. So what WEDG can do is really help guide the engineers and the architects on a project to design projects that are going to really create community benefits and create environmental benefits. We're looking at elements that are above and beyond or outside of what you're required to do by a city or a state. There's certain regulatory requirements that every project has to do, and you have to have in New York a 30-foot walkway along the waterfront. That's not that exciting of a community amenity. That's not something that's going to make the waterfront special. We want to see that there's a lot more to it than that, and can help guide the engineers and architects on a project to get there. We set performance targets that city officials or developers can use in decision making. We act as a watchdog to ensure that a project's claims are legitimate. So when they say, hey, we're being sustainable, that can mean a lot of things. That can also be very easily kind of greenwashed. We're going to actually have experts in the field look at the project and say, is this actually valid or not? And we have provide specific technical feedback on 143 different metrics to understand, are these claims valid or not? And we have had, you know, in that watchdog role, we have had projects that have applied for WEDG verification. They've paid because it is a fee for service. They've paid for the review, and Waterfront Alliance has come back and said, no, this is not good enough. You do not get the endorsement. You do not get the certification. Here are all the things that we see as wrong with the project. So there is that a real rigor behind the review process, and it's a way to hold projects accountable. And then we also, importantly in there, and we'll spend a little time with this when we get to like the pieces of what's actually in the standard, we assess whether the project aligns well with community feedback. That's something that we specifically look for, and look for evidence that the project is actually following community feedback. Flipping this a bit from what WEDG does to what you can do as community members, and environmental practitioners and community board delegates, and just folks who are involved in and interested in the waterfront. When there are community engagement sessions happening in your neighborhoods for projects, whether that's, you know, FIDI Seaport master plan is in the middle of those right now in Lower Manhattan. If you're working on, you know, If you're in Long Island City, there's a series of engagements happening now along LIC North, and then just throughout the project or throughout the city and across the country where projects are happening. There are public workshops, there are comment periods. Ask the developers, ask the city agencies, hey, is this project compliant to WEDG? That's all. You don't need to kind of insist that they're doing it. You don't need to know the technical components. You don't need to have the engineering background. Ask if they're in compliance with WEDG. That's one way that you can tell the developers that, hey, we want a really exceptional project here. You can tell your local elected officials that you want to see WEDG be part of projects. Elected officials have a role in the formal land use review processes here and elsewhere. Tell them that you want to see WEDG verification, that you want to see compliance with WEDG. And then we have the WEDG Professionals course. That is an online training that we offer, and I'll give details of it in a few slides, on demand, or we do a live stream version that goes through the different engineering and landscape architecture and community planning principles behind the system. We've intentionally made that course so that you don't have to be an engineer or an architect or an urban planner to follow and understand it. That's a great way to kind of build fluency in these in the issues of waterfront development, to understand what the challenges are, what's realistic and what expectations can be. But we encourage folks to take that WEDG Professionals course to really get to know this world. You do get a credential after it. You get letters after your name and your email signature. And we see lots of city officials taking that. We see lots of community board members here in New York taking that. Folks who work for or volunteer for environmental groups. If you're actually in, there's a lot of folks from across the country on the webinar today. If you're in a state that touches the Mississippi River, it's actually free to take for advocates and activists. Everywhere else, it's just deeply discounted from what we make the engineers pay. We encourage folks to take the course, and there will be more on how to do that later on. So we've kind of talked around WEDG a lot, and here's what it is and here's what it does, but I want to go now into what's actually in the standard, because that's the important part. That's the part that shapes what's happening on your waterfront. So we're going to go through the 6 categories in WEDG, and within each of those, there's different what we call credits, or different kind of elements of the design that we're looking for, and that we bring in reviewers to provide really significant feedback around. The way WEDG works, just to give you an overview of how the system functions, it's a points-based system. So each of the credits that we'll talk about has a set number of points, and different criteria are worth different points based on how important are they, really emphasizing things like life safety and protection, and how difficult are they to do. The things that, like every project's doing, it's really easy, it's really cheap, aren't worth as much as things that are really challenging and that we want to really reward projects for doing. Those are going to be worth a little more as well. So we'll start with, and then before I move on to, then out of those points, there's a minimum threshold that you need to cross to earn WEDG verification. So there's 250 points across the standard. You need to earn 130 to earn WEDG verification, and it's a pass-fail system. So category 0 is site assessment and planning. And we call it 0 instead of 1 because this is all of the upfront work that a project team needs to do to ensure that they have a really solid design to start from, a really solid foundation to start from. So the first thing is that we want to see that there's a multidisciplinary team involved. So by law, you're required to have an engineer and an architect on most projects. That's what the law requires. We want to see that there's a broader team than that there's more expertise on the team than that. We want to see that there's an ecologist or a biologist, someone who's going to pay attention to the environmental aspects and have a lot of expertise there. We want to see that there's someone who knows the stakeholder engagement world really well and who understands how do we connect with communities effectively. We want to see that there's someone who's going to be involved with the maintenance of the site. involved in the project so that you have so that maintenance planning gets baked in from the beginning. And then we also want to see that a project has done the different ecological assessments, the different vulnerability assessments to understand things like sea level rise, to understand what's going on in the community around this. What do the housing needs look like? What is what are the rents like in this neighborhood? How is our project going to impact that? Um, where are there drainage issues in from the stormwater and sewer system around the neighborhood? All of those things we want to see that the project has done a really solid and robust assessment of. We're also going to look at, is there a plan for equitable stakeholder engagement? And then we assess kind of throughout the standard, was that listened to? And I'll do more on that in just a second. And then we also look at maintenance and adaptive management planning. So one of the important things in the standard is that we want to see that the project is maintained well and that there's a plan in place that happens when design is happening, so that you don't kind of have all of these, maintenance doesn't become an afterthought, and that maintenance is funded in some way and somebody has responsibility for it. That's a very important part of WEDG. So I'm going to dive in a little deeper into just those community engagement pieces. So the credit is develop and implement a plan for equitable stakeholder engagement. And here the goal is that you're engaging stakeholders in the vision behind the project, the design and the implementation of the project, so that it becomes a welcoming and an equitable waterfront for all. So in all of these credits, we have a section called design strategies, and that's essentially Waterfront Alliance kind of compiling, hey, here's what we've seen work in different communities and different types of contexts. Here's what we would consider best practices and our advice for you as the project team developing this. Here's what we think you should do. And then second to that is a set of scoring criteria. And this is what we actually assess the project on. So the criteria for engagement is going to include a number of different things, different weights to it. This is a fairly heavily weighted credit. This is 10 points out of the 130 you need, but we want to see that the project has conducted the stakeholder planning and analysis up front, that they've really thought about what are the issues in the community going to be? Who do we really need to be talking to? What are the organizations and groups that have a presence? Are there neighborhood associations? Are there housing associations in the area? How are we going to get in front of business owners? How are we going to get in front of residents? We want to see that that was actually thought about up front, so that the project is being smart about how they're getting in front of folks, and that they also have done kind of an understanding of what are the issues going to be, so that when we want project teams to show up to community engagement going, okay, we already know about this neighborhood, that there's flooding here, here, and here. We know that rising rents are a concern, so that you can actually talk through solutions as part of the engagement process and not just have to share the very basics of your neighborhood that everybody there already knows and that really the project team should know too. We're also going to assess and score on, did they use multiple methods of engagement? So if they only have a public comment period that you have to go to the city's website, you have to go through this long process to provide written comments on a long PDF version of a plan. That's kind of a common thing that happens. That's not good enough for WEDG. We want to see that there are multiple opportunities for people to engage in the project, for people to provide feedback, for people to learn about it. So that just posting and asking for public comments is not sufficient to earn community engagement credit for us. Just having that public workshop that happens one night in a middle school cafeteria, that's not enough to earn this credit. We want to see, are you doing pop-up events? Are you doing surveys? Are you doing site tours? Are you finding ways to show up in the community, meet people where they are, and getting to people in multiple ways, so that you don't just have feedback from kind of the usual suspects. We're also, and this is an important one, and this doesn't only come up in this credit, this happens elsewhere in the standard too. We want to see that the project can provide evidence that engagement influenced design. So we ask the project, hey, point us to us on your site plan. What's different because you heard about it in community engagement? What did you change to respond to community needs? And then we're also, as part of that, going to look through the meeting notes and the feedback and the post-it walls from community engagement, and we're going to assess, hey, it looks like the community kept bringing this thing up. Tell us how you've addressed that. Like we try to throw a couple curveballs at the project in that review process to really understand, did they respond to community feedback appropriately. We're going to want to see that engagement occurred at multiple stages of design. So it's not just, hey, here's our plan. Tell us if you like it, but we're going forward anyways. We want to see that early in the process, community was involved. Once a first kind of design was out there, the community was involved. And then they're going back to say, hey, did we get this right? And that it's an iterative process with the community that happens over time. And then we also want to see engagement during construction as well. So you don't just have, okay, that green wall, if you're in New York, that green wall goes up and we'll see the building when it's done. We want to see that engagement continues over time. So the next category in WEDG is around climate and hazard resilience. So here we're looking at a number of things, including flooding. So the first credit here is going to be avoid and reduce flood risk from the water body. This is where we're looking at, how is the site protected from flooding? Whether you're on a river, whether you're on the ocean, whether you're in the harbor, we want to see that the site's protected. What makes WEDG stand out from what a typical city agency or a state agency is going to require is that we don't just care about, are you protecting the property itself? We're going to care about, are you protecting the community in addition to your property? So we weigh equally in the scoring the site's own, it's called design flood elevation. That's just the height that the building's protected against, or whatever is on the site, building or not, the height that the site's protected against, the height of water. And then we weigh equally with that, are you providing protection beyond the property line? So are you keeping the roadways from getting flooded? Are you keeping the upland areas, those neighboring properties further inland from being flooded? If you're on a river, can you provide what's called compensatory storage, or basically extra storage area for water that's going to help reduce flooding downstream? Are you providing a broader level of protection than just yourself? We're also going to have our requirements for the protection of the site are going to be higher than a typical building code is. So we look at, are you addressing sea level rise? Is there extra kind of additional space on top of that? And that's going to be higher than what a typical building code is going to require. The same kind of structures there for fluvial or overland flooding and stormwater. So we're going to look at, how much of your own stormwater can you manage and have higher expectations than what City of New York or other municipalities would do. But we're also going to, again, heavily reward, are you providing protection beyond the property line? So that means, are you taking areas that don't drain well now, that are offsite, you're thinking about flooding on the roadways and overwhelmed storm drainage, which is common in a lot of older neighborhoods. Are you actually alleviating some of that burden as part of the project? And we also really here emphasize green infrastructure that's going to take water and keep it out of the municipal stormwater systems, because we know that the municipal stormwater systems across the country, and it's particularly acute here in New York, they get overwhelmed very easily. So we want to send as little water as possible to those. And when water is being sent there, delay it as long as possible so they're not overwhelmed when it's raining. So we're really going to emphasize practices that are going to keep water out of those systems and drain on the site itself. We look at stormwater discharge quality. So when water is being put back into the river or into the combined sewer overflows, that it's clean, that it's treated, there's not garbage flowing through it, there's not um, different pollutants that are in it. So we're looking for how are you managing the quality of stormwater discharge. We also look at emergency preparedness. So is there a plan for the property um, when a flood does occur? And we're looking for reduced contributions to urban heat. So are you providing things like shading and vegetation and reducing um, the the amount of dark hard surfaces that you have that are going to make it a really hot site? Community access and connection is going to look at those different elements of access to the site. And I kind of think of Wedge as having this lowercase a for access. It's not just like, can you get down into the water itself? It's, is there public access site on the public access space on the site? Are you looking at visual improvements and sight lines to the site, so that when you're looking down the street from further inland, that you actually can see the water? It's not just blocked by a building. We do have ways of supporting industrial water dependent uses and kind of clustering those in ways that it makes sense. Reducing industrial impacts to human health and well-being. That's one of those kind of a really important EJ principle, environmental justice principle, that's built into the standard. We want to see that, where you are, where we do have these working waterfront sites, because water dependent uses and sites that require shipping and stuff are an important part of the economy. It's also movement by water is a very environmentally friendly way to move goods compared to trucks in particular. So we want to encourage that. It's a place where industry can occur, but where we do that, how are you controlling pollutants and dust and noise beyond what's required uh, uh, beyond what's required to protect the communities around it? Then we're also going to look at diverse programming and educational features on the site, transportation access to the site, maritime or environmental employment opportunities. So there's a workforce development component to WEDG that rewards things like local hiring and local training, waterfront pathway and greenway connectivity, direct connections to the water for people and boats where it's safe to do so. Can you provide kayak launches and beaches and human powered boating? And then supporting diverse and sustainable maritime activity. Is there a place that the fireboats can park? Is there a place that that the kayaks can launch from, or that sort of thing? Edge composition is going to look at what are you doing on the water's edge itself. So if you think of the water's edge as having the spectrum, so at one end you've got concrete and steel in the water, your pile supported platforms, your concrete walls, steel walls. And at the other end, you've got beaches and natural shorelines and wetlands. Wedge wants to move everybody this way towards that more natural end. But we also recognize that in an urban environment, it's not always actually possible. We want to see it, but we recognize it's not always feasible. So what we're going to look at is the extent to which you can build in those natural or nature-based features um, into the site. Excuse me. Can you build those natural features into the site, and over what percentage of the shoreline are you doing so? We want to see that sites are trying to create more natural shoreline shapes and slopes, those that are going to have environmental benefits and potentially wave reduction benefits, which have some resilience value. We want to see that folks are protecting the working edge, and that where you do have that working waterfront infrastructure and ways to tie in ships and stuff, that's protected from sea level rise and from storms. And then where you have to have kind of a hardened shoreline, you have to have a wall instead of a wetland for a variety of reasons. We want to see what we call ecological enhancements to those. So can you use a material that is going to be more environmentally productive? There's a couple companies that we've seen out there that do this work really well. One is eConcrete. That's what's on the screen. So um, they make these big kind of cement rock formations that have a different acidity than normal concrete that makes it so that it's more healthy for the to be in the water. They have these kind of nooks and crannies and little tide pools that you can see on there. They provide places um, for marine life to exist, and they're made of they change the concrete so that there are ways that marine life can adhere to it so that eventually these get covered in different plants and oysters and other material that makes it so that it has the protection that concrete's going to offer, but has environmental value as well. There's also another company, Kind Designs, and another one, One Print, that do kind of similar things with paneling for bulkhead walls, and that provides the structure that you need, but also it's actually really good for the environment. So those kind of things we incentivize through Wedge. We're also going to look at natural resources and sustainability. So siting with ecological sensitivity. Are you building in a place where you're not destroying really sensitive habitats? Are you creating or maintaining ecosystem services and habitat space? You're providing ecosystem connectivity. So we're going to look at things like how big are the habitat spaces on the site? A bunch of really tiny little habitats don't actually contribute that much compared to larger spaces or interconnected spaces. We look at native habitat complexity and biodiversity. So are you providing plants for pollinators? Are you using native plantings on the project rather than invasive or non-native species? Are you avoiding human disturbances to natural resources, redeveloping and cleaning up contaminated sites, using sustainable fill and soil management, renewable energy on the site, reducing your carbon emissions, practicing environmentally responsible construction, particularly with work in the water, which can be really disruptive to the ecosystem, reducing your water use on the site, and then engaging a partner to monitor the site. Then finally, we have innovation, which is the inventive design and exemplary performance category. You can kind of think of these as the bonus points within the WEDG standard. And then there is a set of minimum requirements for WEDG, things that every site has to do. Otherwise, they cannot earn WEDG verification. So they have to, first, they have to be on the water, very basic one. Something that's like across the street from the beach doesn't count for WEDG. The project has to include a soft or natural shoreline somewhere within the project, or you have to have one of those ecological enhancements that we just talked about. You have to do community engagement. You have to have public access to the site. There's some wiggle room for the industrial sites where it's not safe, but then they have to provide some kind of other alternative. You can't intentionally introduce invasive plant species to a site. And then there's a minimum flood resilience that we require that's going to incorporate things like sea level rise. And so, and one of the things that's really important in WEDG is that it thinks about gentrification and how to avoid contributing to that, and how to really make sure that we are paying attention to environmental justice principles. So I've listed a few of the ways on the slide that we interact there, but I think the most important one is ensuring responsiveness to community priorities. And this is a credit that in our last iteration of WEDG, we just entirely rewrote and revisited to ensure that we are finding the most effective ways to engage with communities. We're looking at, as an environmental justice solution, that protection beyond the property line. City regulations, other rating systems typically don't look at that. They're looking at, if you're building something, it can't flood. We are looking at, and even then, often those things still flood. We are looking at, how are you providing a protection to the property, or to the, sorry, not to the property, to the community, so that basement flooding in the sites adjacent doesn't happen. You're protecting people's homes beyond it. We have a preference in the education and programming credit for affordable and free programming. We're rewarding public transportation to the site. We're including those workforce development and local hiring practices, prioritizing human health. So that shows up in the reducing industrial pollutants credit and the decontamination credit. The public access credit is going to look at how are you contributing to wellness through your site design. Um, there's a number, the urban heat credit also does this. There's a number of ways that we're trying to promote the health of the community around the site through good design. And then our verification process, so just so you know how this works and how we actually do the assessment of a site. So the project's going to commit to building to WEDG standards. They sign an agreement with us. They pay up front. There's no refund if you don't pass. And then we're going to do a review at the stage of design called 50% design. So that's kind of early in the process. And Waterfront Alliance is going to bring in its own engineer and landscape architect and environmental professional and urban planner, a team of experts trained on WEDG who are going to just pour over the designs in really significant detail. The typical review when the project team sends over their designs, we're going through somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 pages of designs and narrative and explanation normally. Like it's a lot of material that they're sending to us that we are dissecting. We're then going to do another review at 100% construction documents. You can think of that as when they're at the blueprints. And then we're gonna announce whether they passed it. So Waterfront Alliance kind of project manages the process, and then we are bringing in experts to actually do the scoring. So just to showcase two projects, this one's in construction now. This is Jose Marti Park in Florida. This sits on the Miami River. It's a fairly low income neighborhood to the right, east of Havana, that is starting to experience a lot of tidal flooding. So already, today at king tide, which is kind of the highest annual tides, that this park gets flooded, and that's starting to seep into the roadway in the back of the park. Over the next 10 or 15 years, those king tides are going to start to reach the apartments beyond the park. By the 2070s, 2080s, regular high tide is going to be flooding the neighborhood behind this project. So this park is designed to serve as protection for this neighborhood. So they've raised much of the park. They've stabilized the shoreline. They've redone the stormwater drainage and even made it kind of an educational feature, which we thought was really cool. This had just an incredible kind of community-driven design process of the space and the site. They did a ton of work with restoring the biodiversity at the site, creating these living shorelines. It's a very cool site that's in construction now, that provides protection for this low-income neighborhood. Another site, this is a rendering for it, but the site's actually open now. This is Bronx Point. This is a 100% affordable housing development. It's also soon to be home to the Universal Hip Hop Museum. This is in the Bronx, just near 145th Street. That's the 145th Street Bridge. This was a really challenging site for the team to build on because if you look at it, you've got a rail line in the river, you've got a bridge to the right, you've got the major Deegan Freeway elevated inland from the site, warehouses beyond that. Like this is not a very inviting place to want to be. So they actually engaged the community a lot. It had this community advisory group that one of their big tasks was to figure out what would make people want to actually come to this site. What would make this a pleasant place to live and inviting and feel safe to go through, go under the overpasses and stuff. What would make people feel safe to get out to this site? And they went back and they really did this iterative process with that community group to come up with a very thoughtful design about how do you get people there. They also added plantings to the rocks along the water's edge that are going to add some habitat value. Billy and Oyster Project is here, and they're doing in water work. And there's direct connections to the water here as well that are that give people access to the water in this neighborhood, and it connects really seamlessly with Mill Pond Park next door. So that this property functionally is an extension of that park. So I talked about the WEDG Professionals course before. So for folks who really want to learn more about about Wedge, get to know it in a little more depth, see more case studies of projects that have done this well. We have two ways that folks take the course. So there's the live stream version. This will happen in the afternoons of November 12th and 13th. That's 2 to 6 p.m. Eastern time for folks here in New York. We're really targeting the Mississippi River Valley, which is why we're doing the course in Central Time. There's a registration link down below. And we'll, in follow up to this, we'll send the links to a few materials, but including the registration for the course. And then we also have at wedgeprofessionals.org an on-demand version of the course that you can take anytime. The number one time for people to finish is like Sundays at 10 p.m. I get an email every time someone finishes, and Sundays at 10 p.m. is the number one time. There's about 1,300 folks across the country who've taken the course. It's a lot of engineers and architects and landscape architects and city officials, but there's also a couple hundred environmental activists and community activists and just members of the public who see things happening in their neighborhood and say, I want to be involved in this. New York is a big hub for this, kind of the Northeast in general. It's a lot of folks. We also have kind of pockets in Florida and Chicago and Colorado, different cities in California that are where we have folks trained in Wedge as well. And then before I get to Q&A, because I see we've got a couple questions in the chat, I want to just preview a project that Waterfront Alliance is going to be releasing over the next couple weeks. And I apologize if folks can hear the fire alarm going off in the background. I'm assuming that I'll be alerted if I need to leave the building, but we are Waterfront Alliance has been working with New York City Parks to figure out how do we reduce the flooding in Flushing Meadows Corona Park. We're proposing daylighting Flushing Creek and expanding Meadow Lake, and that's a report that's going to come out just in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that. So I'm going to jump to the Q&A as we shift out of the kind of presentation portion of this and jump into questions. So the first one is that from William Cruz, our estuary and watershed coastline is slowly developing with individual subdivisions with high value waterfront lots and no public access to the water except for community boat ramps. How would Wedge help change that? So one of the ways that we work with communities across the country is through embedding Wedge in policy, so that there are ordinances that's either incentivize or require the use of Wedge. We're in, like as an example, we're in the zoning code in New Rochelle. We're in the design guidelines in Miami, working on that in Chicago. We show up in the land use review process here in New York in different ways. And public access to the site is a requirement in Wedge. So you can't have these high value waterfront lots that don't allow the general public on them. Wedge doesn't apply to single family homes. So we don't work on those types of projects, but anything that is multifamily, that's commercial, that's shopping center, that's industrial even, we're gonna help force the public access there. So it's not just those community boat ramps, and there's different types of access as well. We encourage things like get downs and fishing areas and kayak launches, the whole variety of ways you can access the water. So another question is, who makes up the Wedge review team that reviews projects? I touched on this, but we'll go into a little more depth. Are they Wedge staff or are they professionals working in the industry? It's both. So the Waterfront Alliance oversees the review, and we kind of project manage the process. We are the contact that the project has, but we're going to bring in industry professionals who we've trained and who've gone through the Wedge professionals course, who know the standard really well, but they are practicing professionals in the industry, and they're going to review the project. So there's going to be an engineer, there's going to be a landscape architect, there's going to be an environmental professional who aren't connected to the project, The project team, the design team, doesn't actually know who the reviewers are. We keep a firewall there, so there's not a way that they can influence the reviewers. Um, those folks are going to actually do the scoring, and Waterfront Alliance defers to them on the scoring. But we manage that process. So another question is, are there other standards that you've seen WEDG intersect with, such as the Community Rating System program? That's a FEMA program that helps communities lower their flood insurance rates. WEDG actually aligns incredibly well with that. We have resources available to communities and to projects that kind of line up WEDG with other standards like LEED and Envision, Green Marine, which is a maritime one. So you can see kind of the comparison. We also have resources for, if you created an ordinance around WEDG in a community, how is that going to help your community rating system score, which could potentially lower flood insurance rates across the community. So we have worked on those. We're happy to, if folks want to reach out to me directly, and that's my email on the screen. You can get more information on those. Another question is, what incentives developers have to pursue WEDG as opposed to something like Envision, which is an infrastructure one. There's a lot of similar criteria there. It's probably the most closely aligned. There's Envision, infrastructure. There's Sites, which is landscape architecture. LEED is the energy efficiency one for buildings. Salmon Safe is a stormwater one out in the Pacific Northwest. WELL and FitWell are both kind of building health ones. Two of the key differences that we see in WEDG compared to the other standards is that WEDG looks a lot more at the community impact of a site than some of the other standards do. Like LEED really cares about what's going on inside the building itself. WEDG is going to care about the impact on the community outside of that. We also play a much more robust role in communicating the benefits of a WEDG verified site and communicating that achievement when it does happen. So this just came up in the final review of the Denver project just a few weeks ago. We went through the score of the project with the engineers and landscape architects on the team and said, here's where you score. You guys passed. It's a really cool project. Now let's talk about the rollout. Let's talk about how we tell everybody in Denver that this is happening, and you've achieved this. We're the only rating system that's going to do that. So that's a benefit for the project team to go through us. Well, also I'll just throw it out there. We're a little cheaper than Envision and LEED as well. Another question is, what kinds of professionals are involved in WEDG? Is it only for architects and engineers? Definitely not. So if we look at who has taken the WEDG course, engineers and architects and landscape architects are a big piece. Urban planners are a big piece. It's folks who work for cities. So it's the Parks Department, it's economic development, it's public works, all of those kind of folks. There are volunteers and environmental groups that have taken it. People who care about conservation have taken it. Randomly, there's 2 documentarians that have gone through it. It's folks who just live in waterfront neighborhoods and say, if I keep building on my waterfront, I want to know more about the process. They've taken it. Community board members here in New York have gone through our course. So it's really designed to be accessible. We didn't create the course so that you had to be an engineer to understand the course. You learn a little bit about engineering, you learn a little bit about landscape architecture, you learn a little bit about planning, you learn a little bit about ecology and natural resources. It's meant to be this kind of broad overview of what do you need to know about projects on the waterfront. Another question is, are there projects in California in the pipeline getting accredited? There's one in the pipeline. It's an offshore wind project, so it's a long way from actually being built. But it's a port facility for offshore wind. That'll be the first in California. We're also going to be doing a workshop in San Francisco in the spring with BCDC, which is the regulatory agency for San Francisco Bay, and a couple other partners out there as well. And then here in Mont, and this will be probably my last question, just based on time. John asked, here in Montpelier, Vermont, we hope to initiate a River's Edge master planning process in the next year. You have examples where WEDG has guided a master planning process. Yes, those exist out there. John, I'd encourage you to email me after this, and I can send you some of those examples. But WEDG fairly frequently comes up in master plans and is a way to help recognize kind of the community values that are there, help shape future design. There's multiple communities across the country that have included references to WEDG, pulled resources from WEDG and guidance from WEDG, and built it into a master planning process. Waterfront Alliance can also be a resource in that. So we're happy to meet with the planning groups or the consultants or the committees that are putting together these master plans, show up in some of those community engagement sessions. We're happy to partner in that way. And then it looks like one last question. Crucilli is excited to hear about Flushing Creek. That's great. We're excited about that too. Mid-October is when that comes out. The last question from Letha, who actually is a WEDG associate. She has taken the course. Adaptive management plans are not commonly a feature of most projects. Could you explain a little more, maybe provide examples of WEDG verified projects that do have a documented plan that's publicly available? So all projects are required in WEDG to have a maintenance plan. That's going to have things like how often are we, checking the stormwater systems, and how are we, doing an assessment of the condition of the bulkhead wall, and how often are we cleaning up the rain gardens and stuff on the project. All the basic maintenance tasks need to be documented. That's a requirement of WEDG. We have a step above that though, called adaptive management. And that's essentially looking at like the trigger points of things that could happen in the future that the project should really think about, but that are going to require some decision making later on, and provide some guidance from the design team on how to do that. So an example of that, and I don't know of any of these plans that are actually truly publicly accessible, because oftentimes they're going to include stuff that's going to interact with like the security of the site, so they're not typically made public. But an example of how this shows up is, projects might be trying to figure out like how much sea level do we need to plan for, and they can bring in kind of this concept of adaptive design where you build a stronger foundation than you need in case you have to build higher later, in case you have to install a taller seawall because in 2080 sea level rise is worse than we thought. So we encourage things like that. It keeps the cost low at the beginning, keeps a reasonable amount of protection, but just in case there's a point in the future where you have to make a decision that you're going to build higher, that you are prepared for that. Another example is, thinking about, here in New York, we have a marine borer issue. So little bugs that eat all the timber piles, the posts that a lot of waterfront piers work on. So at some point, projects may need to, if they continue to deteriorate, because those little bugs are eating them, how are you going to go about doing that? Have you thought about at what point you start replacing them in a thoughtful way? That's something that we would consider adaptive management, that it's important to think about early on in design, but it's beyond just what a standard maintenance practice would be. So with that, thank you for that question, Letha. It's great to have everyone join today. We will be posting this webinar to YouTube, and hope that folks enjoyed it. Feel free to reach out. You have my email address. Again, I'm Joseph Sutkowi, Chief Waterfront Design Officer at Waterfront Alliance. Enjoy your Climate Week. There's lots of other events happening across the week. Check out waterfrontalliance.org for a list of our events. Thank you all so much for being here.